Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this seminar hosted by the Institute for Policy Research. The Institute for Policy Research is a leading public policy research institute based at the University of Bath. We aim to further the public good through research into issues of significant relevance to policy debate, decision-making, building links between the worlds of policy, practice, and academic research. This afternoon, we have Professor Tim Eibel, who will be the chair for this session. And we have a very important guest from the United States, Professor Rick Miller, President Emeritus of Olin College, who will be responded to by our own Vice Chancellor, Professor Ian White, and Professor Marcella McManus from our engineering faculty. So without further ado, I turn over the emceeing of this afternoon's hopefully lively and informative session to Professor Eibel.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charlie. This is a fabulous opportunity that we have in front of us. So at the outset, Rick, thank you so much for being with us. It's wonderful to have you with us. Okay, so first of all, I should start with myself. My name is Tim Eibel. I'm Associate Dean in Learning and Teaching in the Engineering and Design faculty. And we are talking about the future of higher education. And right now, what could possibly be more topical in universities? So we're going to be hearing in particular about the lessons from the first 20 years of Olin College. Olin College, as many of you listening in will know, has rapidly built an absolutely extraordinary reputation for transformative education in engineering. And I'm sure Rick will touch on this, but actually the lessons, of course, are applicable far beyond merely engineering. So we will first hear from Professor Rick Miller, who's the founding president of Olin College. Then we'll hear from Professor Ian White, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Bath. And then we'll hear from Professor Marcel McManus, who directs our Center for Sustainable and Circular Technologies at the University of Bath. And there will be time for questions at the end, but we will finish at a hard finish at 4:30 p.m. UK time. So if I may, I'm going to introduce Professor Rick Miller. Rick Miller was appointed president and first employee of Olin College of Engineering in 1999, where he served as the college's founding president until June 2020. In September 2020, he joined MIT as the Jerome C. Hunsaker Visiting Professor of Aerospace Systems. Prior to joining Olin, he served as Dean of Engineering at the University of Iowa, Associate Dean of Engineering at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and Assistant Professor of Engineering at the University of California, Santa Barbara. With a background in applied mechanics and current interest in innovation in higher education, Miller is the author of more than 100 reviewed journal articles and other technical publications. He received the 2017 Brock International Prize in Education for his many contributions to the reinvention of engineering education. It's such a good word, reinvention of engineering education in the 21st century. Together with two Olin colleagues, he received the 2013 Bernard M. Gordon Prize from the US National Academy of Engineering for innovation in engineering and technology education. Recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he is a member of both the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Inventors. In 2011, he received the Marlowe Award for Creative and Distinguished Administrative Leadership from the American Society for Engineering Education. Miller served as chair of the National Academy's Board on Higher Education and Workforce and chair of the Engineering Advisory Committee of the US National Science Foundation. He has also served on advisory boards and committees for Harvard, Stanford, NAE, NAS, and the US Military Academy at West Point, in addition to many others. Furthermore, he has served as a consultant to the World Bank in the establishment of new universities in developing countries. A frequent speaker on engineering education, he received the 2002 Distinguished Engineering Alumnus Award from the University of California, Davis, where he earned his BS. He earned his MS from MIT and PhD from Caltech, where he received the 2014 Caltech Distinguished Alumni Award. It's a fantastic CV. So, Rick, we're so looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. You don't know this, but the UK has always been a very special place in my family's heart. And I go there as frequently as I can, and I've learned so much from our colleagues in the UK. And I only wish that I had the opportunity to be at the University of Bath today. As we were chatting before this session started, Zoom is a pretty good way for you to hear from me, but it's a pretty bad way for me to understand your context and your situation. So we'll have to make do. Um, it's a privilege to talk to you about this issue of the future of higher ed. It's something that's been on my mind a lot. And so I want to take you through a series of things, including first, what is Olin? What's the story there? And then what are the lessons learned and what do we see when we look in the future? So first, let me talk a little bit about Olin. What is Olin College? Some of you may have heard about it. There's a number of materials online, but let me just say that it was first chartered in 1997. You can see the timeline here by the Olin Foundation, who has a long history in higher education in the US. In fact, they have built 78 buildings on 58 university campuses over 50 years. Mr. Olin passed away in 1951, and since then, the foundation has been funding higher education. I was the first employee, and I arrived on the scene in 1999, but at that point, Olin College was not yet a place. It was just an idea. The college consisted really of 5 people, the 4 directors of the Olin Foundation and me. And by the way, none of the directors of the Olin Foundation are engineers, and none of them had ever worked in higher education, and they brought with them $460 million to start over. What could go wrong with this? That was something I discovered later in terms of getting decisions made. Nevertheless, we built the founding faculty in 2000 and 2001. I want to talk later about this. We started what's called the Olin Partner Year. This was because we had so much to learn. We brought 15 boys and 15 girls who spent a year living in construction trailers in the parking lot while the campus was being built. They were not students. They did not take courses because we didn't have courses yet. We used them to do experiments that you can't do at Harvard because these experiments were designed to fail, specifically so we could watch them fail, so we could see how education really works. And we learned more from those students in that year than we did from any papers or books or conferences that we went to. And furthermore, because we did it ourselves, we believed it. Otherwise, we would have been very skeptical. So I'll talk more about that later. The real vision for the school was created by Mr. Milas, who was the president of the foundation for many years, also the first chairman of the board, and my boss for the first number of years at Olin. And he pointed out that there's a lot of unhappiness about the way engineering is taught. And this is back in the 1990s. It was not an uninformed startup. We had close advice from Joseph Bordogna, who was the chief operating officer of the National Science Foundation and the sponsor of the Engineering Education Coalitions program across the US in the 90s, and John Prados, who was the executive vice president for academic affairs at the University of Tennessee system and the president of ABET, the accreditation board at the time. About this unhappiness, let me just give you a little clue. Gallup survey in 2014, 96% of chief academic officers in the US report that they are doing that's a typo, a good job of preparing graduates for the workplace, but only 14% of the public and 11% of business leaders strongly agree with this. So there's a gap here between what we are thinking about in higher ed and what the public thinks about in higher ed. Another interesting fact, ABET, the accreditation board, for 50 years has listed as the #1 need in engineering education, better communication skills of graduates. It's interesting, given all of the computer, artificial intelligence and high nanotechnology and CRISPR and so forth that's happened, it's communication skills that are #1 according to the practicing engineering profession in the US. And I don't think what they're talking about is go to the English department and take a course in writing. This is more like what you might hear from a marriage counselor who says, your marriage is not working, you need to work on your communication. By the way, employers tell us that engineering graduates almost always have more technical competence than is needed for the BS level work. If they're not going to be employed in 2 years, it's not because their technical competence was substandard, it's because they were very poor in working with others, teamwork. So this is what we're hearing. We concluded in the 90s that we need to change 3 things to fix this. Number 1, we need to change the people. We're teaching the wrong people. Secondly, we're teaching them the wrong stuff. And we're using teaching methods that are known to be largely ineffective. Otherwise, though, we're doing a great job. So we had some work to do. So this is a fundamental problem that needed to be experimented with. Let me just tell you a couple of these things. Teaching them the wrong stuff, for example, because I imagine there's a number of engineers watching this, and we probably all had the same textbooks on strength of materials and statics and dynamics and electric circuits and linear systems theory and computing and so on. Well, turns out when I was young, I had an opportunity for a summer internship while I was about a junior in college. I came from a farming family and I didn't have an opportunity to go to a big city where there were high-tech engineering jobs. So I went to the public works department of the local county that I grew up in. And I got to work on an interesting problem. Turns out that they were trying to figure out where to relocate the landfill. You know, the garbage dump where you remove all of the refuse from the city and put it out in the country somewhere. So the problem was that the current one had filled up and they needed to find the location on a map of a new one. Now this happened to be in about 1970 when digital computing was first coming out. And this county had just purchased its first digital computer, which ran on the software Fortran, which none of the practicing engineers in the county understood. None of them knew how to program it. And I showed up on the scene, so they gave me this job. And the job was simply minimize the cost to the public of location of this new landfill. Oh, and by the way, also the transfer station in the city where the little trucks put the stuff into the long haul trucks. Give us the XY coordinates on the map. So those engineers in the crowd will recognize this as a linear programming problem. And I did what engineers do. We solve problems, and we wound up doing this with a digital computer. So we used equations. I got these 2 coordinates in a few weeks. Director of Public Works surprisingly went to a public hearing to demonstrate the answers. You know, hey, we got this kid from the University of California, he knows how to use computers, so man, this is the right answer. Put it up on the screen, and you can sort of imagine what happened. This is really a public policy question, right? It's not an engineering question, which we learned. The first hand goes up, and somebody says, oh, did you know that the place you've located is within a mile of the farm of one of the members of the county board of supervisors who has to approve this? Have you thought about that? Oops. Oh, and then another hand went up. Oh, you've located the transfer station right in the center of the city in the depressed ghetto adjacent to the jail where most of the underrepresented minorities live. And here you go again, taking advantage of us in order to save a few bucks for the white privileged people who live in the suburbs. Oh, note to self, engineering is not about equations. Engineering is about people. We need to get this right. We're teaching them the wrong stuff. We're teaching them equations in the absence of understanding the context. Oh, and we're using teaching methods which are known to be largely ineffective. So bear with me for this very short story about math, because my first couple of years in teaching, actually as a graduate student at Caltech, and then as a young assistant professor at the University of California, I taught applied math. So here's how the story goes. Teaching math in 1950, maybe around the 5th grade where you're dealing with fractions. So a logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is 4/5 of his price. How much is his profit? Pretty straightforward question in 1950. But in 1960, same class, same chapter, a logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is 4/5 of the price, or $80. How much is his profit? Notice something different there? Okay, so teaching math in 1970. A logger exchanges a set L of lumber for a set M of money. Now the cardinality of set M is 100. Make a graph of the set M with 100 points in it, and also make a graph of the subset of M for C, the cost of production, which contains 20 fewer points than the set M, and answer the following question: what's the cardinality of the set P of profits? Maybe some of you are old enough to remember that. Didn't work very well. Test scores plummeted. So what happened in teaching math in 1980? A logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is $80 and his profit is $20. Your assignment? Underline the number 20. Okay, so teaching math in 1990. By cutting down beautiful forest trees, a logger makes $20. What do you think of this way of making a living? By the way, how did the forest squirrels and birds feel while the logger was cutting down those trees? Well, I think you get the point. Teaching is not going in the same way it was when we were young, and the teaching methods we're using are not as effective. Okay, so let me see if I can get to the next one. So Olin College, in the face of all this, was intended to be different, not for the mere sake of being different, but in order to become an important and constant contributor to the advancement of engineering education in America and throughout the world. That's right in the founding precepts that Mr. Milas wrote before we built the school. Interpretation: Olin College is intended to become an education laboratory where experimentation is what we do. Our view is that the role of Olin is like this tugboat in the harbor. In higher education, it's like this giant aircraft carrier. Now, this is important. If you do the job right, the job of the tugboat is not to get the aircraft carrier to follow the tugboat. They have different roles. They're built differently, as you can see. Our job is to push 90 degrees on the bow of the aircraft carrier to help it reorient a few degrees to the left or to the right. In order to be a tugboat, we have to be built as an experimental facility. So we have no tenure. We have no academic departments. Every student gets $100,000 in merit scholarships over 4 years, and everything has an expiration date, at least in principle, including the curriculum. So don't fall in love with it because it will change as well. None of us has tenure, and neither does the curriculum. Okay, so lessons learned from this experimentation during the Olin partner year. Number one, we found out by experimentation, students are much more capable of independent learning than we think. If we have time at the end, I can give you some examples. Engineering is not a body of knowledge. Let me repeat that. Engineering is not a body of knowledge. It's not a transcript with a set of grades alongside these technical courses. It's a process. For example, the aircraft industry was built by a couple of bicycle mechanics in Ohio who kept jumping off a cliff with their wings on their back. Oh, there's something strange happening with my computer, so let me turn that off. Otherwise, it was going to restart in a second. These mechanics jumped off a cliff with these wings on their back, and every time they did it, it failed, and they said there must be a better way, and that's the process of engineering. Everything that you know as engineering today was created by that process. And by the way, kids are thrilled with that process. There's an adventure to it. Memorizing equations from a book, not so much. By the way, working in teams can create a momentum of learning. If you're told not to talk to your neighbor, turn in the problems tomorrow, and you do as much as you can and you get stuck, if you're lucky, in 2 weeks, you get the paper back with a few scribbly lines that says this is what the answer is, if you can even remember what the problem was. But if you have a team, you'll almost never get stuck because somebody in the team says, I had an idea and this is what worked. And learning continues at a very fast pace. And by the way, focusing on problems that matter, learning them in context, and collaborating in teams can build both competence and mindset. And this mindset thing is really big. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. And none of this is limited to the field of engineering. It's just as applicable to policy as it is to engineering. We concluded after this year that an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make a better world. You remember what I said about educating the wrong people? I'm here because my math teacher in high school told me that I was good at math, and so therefore I should think about being an engineer. So we have a filter. We only bring in people who have good math skills. But an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been. We need to be bringing in people who have a vision for change, a vision for a better world. We can add the math skills to people with vision easier than we can add the vision to people with math skills. Okay, it's time to move on. We have a course which is teaching people about design creativity. It touches identity, agency, and purpose at a deeper level as well. So it's about engineering design, but it's more than engineering design. It's human-centered. So engineering starts with people and it ends with people. And you have to interview these people to find out what their concerns are, to decide what it is that needs to be designed. If you ask the students to identify a group of people whose lives they want to change, not someday, but within 4 months, you get them engaged and they wind up really caring and they build a bond with the people that they interview. They go through a process of brainstorming for ideas that might change these people's lives, which is part of the technical part of the course, in which case they build empathy and intrinsic motivation. If they build a prototype of this thing that the people they're interviewing then tells them would change their lives, it winds up building in them a sense of purpose, agency. I can change the world. I don't have to have a PhD in physics from Cambridge in order to make an impact in the world. Maybe I can do this today. And if you build identity, agency, and purpose, we're learning from psychology, you build in resilience, a sense of commitment to a field, and a willingness to endure a lot of difficulty in order to really make your life matter. Now, Olin has been recognized in a global state-of-the-art in engineering education study from MIT in 2018, which was a surprise to me. We had only been teaching courses about 15 years at that point, and the rankings were even more surprising. Olin wound up being identified #1 in the world, ahead of MIT in this particular study, which, by the way, was conducted by Ruth Graham in the UK. I think she's fairly well known as an educational researcher. Now, let me move on to some things which are more what we have learned from all of this. First off, with a broad sweep, the future of education in general is moving from left to right. And we have, for generations, thought about the knowledge economy, differentiating us from the agrarian economy and the industrial economy. This is about what you know. And the idea is, this is why we send our kids to school, because we believe, almost without question, the more you know, the better your life will be. So what do? We organize our schools with a person who has a PhD on the stage, because after all, how can you teach somebody knowledge if you don't have knowledge? And a PhD is kind of a certificate that says you know something. That's why we have all PhDs. And we organize them efficiently by putting them in rows with a blackboard. And then we find out if they learned anything by asking them questions at the end, a test. So for example, you might imagine that the whole world would be better if everybody knew things. And you might test this by a TV quiz show, which in the US is called Jeopardy! And I'm sure there's similar ones in other parts of the world. The idea here is that contestants on stage have these little clickers in their hand and you ask them trivia questions. If they click the answer first, they get money. So this is what we're doing for 500 years. There's a problem with this now. It's called Google. So while you're on stage trying to find the answer to a question, people in the audience can Google it on their iPhone and get the answer before you have a chance to say anything. This changes everything. This changes the value of knowing things alone. That's like in the air now. Everybody has this. And this has forced a shift in the economy to what I'm calling now a maker economy, where the role of education is different. It's about, yes, you still put things in their head. They often follow what you do, and then they attempt to do it on their own. The teacher is now no longer the expert who is infallible in their knowledge of how to derive the Navier-Stokes equations from a blank sheet. And instead, they're a guide on the side, like a coach. You organize the students now in small groups, like a table with 5 people there, and they're working on a maker project. Like, for example, making a robot. Or maybe they're composing music or writing a book. By the way, life is a maker project. And the skill of working with others to make something that you're not really sure of when you start is fundamental life skill. How do you know if it worked? Well, we're producing graduates who are measured not by what they know, but what they can do with what they know. This is now becoming an important issue, for example, getting a job at Google. This is not the end. We can foresee the innovation economy in which what's really important is what comes out of kids' heads. It's the original ideas and insights that have the most value. We don't actually know what the role is of having a person with a PhD there. May be useful, may not be useful. Peers and mentors appear to play a really important role. What are the tools to make it happen in the organization? I'm not sure. Possibly intrinsic motivation and design thinking, like the course that I just outlined for you. What is the outcome? How do you know if it worked? Well, it's what you conceive that really matters. So this is actually not new. We are slow to catch up. Yeats, years ago, said education is not the filling of a pail, which is on the left, but the lighting of a fire, which is on the right. It's getting kids excited about creating this. By the way, education theorists are familiar with this too. Turns out passive learning is what happens when you put content in kids' heads. Active learning is what happens when you seek the original ideas and insights from them. And the more active you are, the more authentic, the more robust, and the more retention you get in the learning that kids have. Now, why education must change? This is a new issue. If you look at world population growth through history, and I think this graph is probably the most important takeaway, for millions of years, humans' population has been less than 1 billion, and then it skyrockets about 1900. So what was going on around 1900? Have you heard of the Industrial Revolution in science and technology, higher education? We've had an impact on the planet. So we beat our chests and crow with bravado about how important we are and how we've made the world a better place. It's gotten higher because we've reduced the death rate. It's basically what's happened. We have the most common cause of death in 1940 in the US was waterborne disease. And the average lifespan was in the 40s. By the year 2000, the lifespan had increased to high 70s. And we pretty much eliminated waterborne disease by the technology of clean water. However, population biologists have seen this graph before. It doesn't end well. This is what the population of the rabbits looked like in the outback of Australia when the wolves were eliminated. What happened? The rabbits eliminated themselves through overpopulation. This constitutes an existential threat. So with the technology that we've created that made all this possible comes a new responsibility to use the technology in ways that will result in outcomes for our species which are desirable. By the way, our education was not designed with these kinds of challenges in mind. So the National Academy of Engineering developed grand challenges for the 21st century. There's a list of them there. In the UN developed Sustainable Development Goals, which has an overlap between the two. And if you look at them together, the kinds of outcomes we need for graduates today are global, complex, and multidisciplinary. Things like security, sustainability, health, and enhancing life as the population decreases. I mean, the health issue is obviously the pandemic is a good example. Sustainability is obviously global climate change. Security, have you heard of the problems with social media, with misinformation, and with nationalism, and with nuclear weapons? How does that end? We need a new kind of education for the 21st century, completely new. So if you want to know more about this NAE Grand Challenge Scholars Program, which is an approach which is started in the US to embrace a change in education for all engineers to think globally about the problems they're solving, to dedicate their career to something that matters, you could check out this website. Here's an illustration of how it's grown. It started actually in 2009 with 3 schools, Olin College, University of Southern California, and Duke University. And we invited others to join us, and you can see how it's grown. There are now 93 active universities, 74 in the US and 19 international in 13 countries. And there are 42 of them that are in line to join. So change is underway. Now, our traditional approach to higher education may actually be preventing us from producing the innovators we need. There's a lot here to cover. So let me give you first some definitions, because innovation is probably the most overused word today. So creativity is the process of generating original ideas and insights. That's actually Sir Ken Robinson from the UK. Inventiveness, the process of generating original ideas and insights that have value. Innovation, process of generating original ideas and insights that have value and then implementing them in ways that change the way people live. The point is, if you don't implement it, it's not an innovation, it's just an idea. What we really need are profound innovations. And this is an innovation so profound that no one can remember life before it was introduced, like the automobile or the airplane, now the iPhone, software like social media. How does this work? This could be a map of a major multidimensional university in the US and probably in other parts of the world. This might be, for example, let me pick on the University of Michigan. It's a big place. It's going to be fine whether they agree with what I say or not. In the upper left-hand corner is this blue circle, which we have the engineering quad. So all the students are going to major in engineering live there, and they live there for 4 years. 75% of their course credits will be in STEM courses, science, technology, engineering, and math, because we want STEM majors to understand the equations. Nobody said you don't need them. We're just saying it's maybe imbalanced. I mean, you really want to make sure that the engineering graduates know the stress equations, because when you buckle up in an airplane to go home tonight, you want to make sure that every engineering graduate got the right answer before your life is online. So that's why they do it, but they wind up spending all their time in that little quarter. If you think about what we're teaching, almost every STEM teacher teaches about what I'm going to call feasibility. Is this possible based on what we know about natural law? Is it feasible? To the exclusion almost of everything else. But on the other side of campus is this business school. And kids enroll there for 4 years and they take a different curriculum, and it's mostly about viability. Almost every instructor talks about accounting, marketing and managing, about organizational structure, about legalities of business formation, to the exclusion of feasibility. And by the way, down in the desirability circle, this may be where the university library is, which is about 2 miles away from the blue circle at Michigan. This is where students studying psychology, arts, and humanities take their courses. By the way, people who study in those fields, and I know a lot about this because I have 2 daughters who did, they have different questions. Questions like, what is the meaning of beauty? What is the meaning of truth and justice? What is the meaning of love? Now, these are questions that are important. They determine almost all of human motivation. On the other hand, these questions do not get measured by vectors and calculus or spreadsheets in the business school. They're a completely different way of thinking. Why does this matter? Well, here's why it matters. Because it's only when these 3 things come together that you have innovation. I'm going to challenge you. I don't think you can think of any profound innovations that have changed the world that aren't simultaneously feasible, viable, and desirable. And we need hundreds of young people today who are committed in one brain to have all 3 of these things together in order to generate original ideas and insights that can change the world. No amount of emphasis on narrow specialized courses will produce the innovators we need. And that's a fundamental structural problem we have in the way we think about higher education today, is about specialization. 20th century innovators, though, require more than specialized knowledge. For example, attitude plays a really important role. Now, more often than not, your attitude determines your altitude in life, not your aptitude. This fellow, without having any legs, will get higher on that mountain than I ever will, because he is determined to make it happen. This is also directly out of what we're hearing from the business world. Norm Augustine, who's the former CEO of Lockheed Martin in the US, 2016 in Aviation Week and Space Technology, declared that motivation almost always beats raw talent in the workplace. Where do we work on motivation in higher ed? These attitudes, behaviors, and motivations have long been the center of conversation in the non-academic corporate world. IBM, in the lower left-hand corner, created the T-shaped individual more than 25 years ago. If you listen hard to what corporations are telling us, remember that gap that I talked about at the beginning, where 96% of chief academic officers think we're doing a great job, but only 11% of business officers. Here's what they say. We need graduates who, yeah, they can solve the equations, but you're already overdoing that. We need graduates who have a collaborative mindset, who have an entrepreneurial mindset, who have an interdisciplinary mindset. They're not confined by the degree they have, who have a global mindset, and above all now, an ethical mindset to address something I'm going to call technological utopian naivete. We have this sense after the 20th century that if we as engineers invented it, and if it's something that the public will pay for, obviously it's good for society. Well, maybe not so much. We need to broaden our responsibility to include the unintended consequences of the use of what we're doing. It's not just about content knowledge now. We need to take a broader sweep of what we're educating for. Mindset. Now, when I first came onto this, I thought this was like one of those self-help things you find in a book in the airport, but it's not. It's in fact real. It can be taught, and it's important. Carol Dweck, who's a professor at Stanford University, the first winner of the Yeadon Prize, a $4 million prize for educational change that came up just a few years ago, has been doing work for dozens of years about mindset in young people. And what she found out is that what you believe about yourself has an enormous impact on what you will achieve in your life. In particular, if you believe that your intelligence is something you inherited from your parents, like your eye color, and there's nothing you can do about it, and if only people who have high birth intelligence are able to succeed in life, then you give up and you won't challenge yourself, and you have what's called a fixed mindset. But if you believe that your intelligence is sort of like a muscle and that you can grow it by challenging yourself, you have no limit to what you can do. And she's got tons of data that shows this is true. And she explains this very well in this book that I highly recommend. Another psychologist, Angela Duckworth, the University of Pennsylvania, talked about grit, the power of passion and perseverance. People who succeed in life are not always the ones who got an A+ in the math class. They're the ones who were absolutely determined and never gave up. Athletics can teach this, many other things. This is not just about children. James Heckman at the University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner in economics, grit or determination is often a better predictor of success than either knowledge or intelligence. There's a lot to learn here, and I think all educators need to become familiar with these ideas. In my case, this is Mel Ramey. He was my undergraduate advisor. Growing up on a farm, he's the first person with a PhD that I ever met. He was also the first engineer that I ever met. And I learned from him, by his example, that hopeful faculty members spread hope among their students, while cynical faculty members spread cynicism. I know, you've never heard of a cynical faculty member, have you? That's a joke, in case you haven't. I'm not from the higher ed. But you have never heard of a cynical entrepreneur, because there's no room for cynicism in the kind of determination and risk-taking it takes to create something new. Now, lessons learned from the COVID experience. I'm always asked about this because the last year changed everything. First off, learning is not a place, but an activity. So of course you can learn online. Remote learning can be very effective, but the trick is engagement. Remember that concept that when passive learning takes place, students can't remember, they can't process the information, but if they're engaged, you can't forget it. But remote learning poorly addresses social and emotional objectives like belonging and teamwork. Angela Duckworth, a psychologist, has written about this. Making and building online present significant challenges. So if you're in art class where you have to learn how to do things in a sculpture class, or if you are an engineer and you have to learn how to use a milling machine and you don't have one and all you can do is look at a YouTube video, it's not the same. We haven't figured out how to deal with that. And of course, if everybody is in a different environment, not in the same residence hall, their access to quality internet connectivity is unmanaged and is random. And those that have difficult connectivity amplifies the inequality in what's going on in the learning environment. So lots of things to process here, and we're really early in this. And I'll say more about this in a minute. But I've learned some other messages which are much more weighting on my mind than those that have to do with the technology of online learning. We found out, at least in the US, there's a need for real critical thinking among our population. Have you heard of the popularity of conspiracy theories? Some of which that make things like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus look harmless, and are much more unlikely than those. And the importance of truth. The whole existence of objective truth has become questioned in ways that I never would have imagined possible. The next time I hear somebody say, well, a lot of people agree with me as the evidence that they present for why they have some conspiracy theory in the front of their head, I think I'm going to throw up. We are not doing a very good job of teaching people fundamentally to reject ideas that don't have evidence and are outrageous. And the disregard for science and scientific process is stunning. The trust in vaccines, for example. How can people not realize that our only hope for getting through these pandemics is science? And of course, the unprecedented public disapproval of all of higher education. And I think that's our responsibility. We need to look in the mirror to see what is it that we're doing and saying that ignores the audience, that comes across as, I'm going to say, judgmental, condescending, and self-righteous. If you have that in your heart as you go to explain people why you do what you do, good luck with changing minds. Some promising new ways to improve teaching, since we're talking about this. We must teach how to think, not what to think. This is really important right now. For example, I used to think X, but now I think Y is the standard format that Howard Gardner, cognitive psychologist at Harvard, uses for determining whether learning happened. It's beyond transfer of content knowledge now. It includes attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs, or mindset too, as Carol Dweck has pointed out. Now, one of the things that might be useful, particularly in the policy professional space, is simulation-based learning to change beliefs and intrinsic motivation. So it's not about the facts now. We've found that people are capable of somehow pigeonholing the facts and disregarding them in their beliefs. It's about moving beyond information and getting to commitment and understanding in your heart what needs to happen. So I found this really interesting article in the current issue of Spectrum magazine at MIT, Why Care About Climate Change. John Sturman is a faculty member there. He helps people experience the impacts of action and inaction. So if you want people to internalize the message of the science, you should engage them in experimentation with their current understanding and let them simulate how the world would turn out if they made decisions based on those assumptions. He has some evidence there, which I think is important for all of us. Another one, a real hero of mine, Professor Eric Mazur, a physics professor at Harvard, has done an awful lot of groundbreaking work in education, has done the most careful and thorough analysis of Zoom-assisted learning that I've seen. He took, for example, an 80-student class in physics. He broke them into 20 small groups, so they're really quite small. They had completely asynchronous discussions, peer learning, team projects, and continuous faculty and TA intervention. And he measured the before and after, and he found that there's a substantial improvement in learning, but also of the self-efficacy during the COVID remote pedagogy. There's some real promise here. And it's not just Harvard, there are other schools doing this too. So what can we learn from this about educating professional policymakers? So I'm almost at the end of this marathon here that we're having to endure. Professional education versus liberal education. There's a big, unfortunate, I think, bias in the university about this. And I think, I mean, it exists in the US. I think it may be even worse in Europe. There's tracking of students by the time they're like in the 5th grade, maybe 10, 11 years old. You're in the professional or technical or vocational track, and someone else is in the university track, the liberal education track. And at that point, their paths diverge. But the kind of professional education that policymakers need has to straddle these two things. STEM, the value of reliable prediction and simulation. One of the problems with this divergence that we've created, this artificial separation, is that people in the liberal education track, maybe history, political science, wind up, or economics, wind up having minimal exposure to artificial intelligence, to computing, to physics, to chemistry and biology. Those are considered different kinds of people. And so we don't talk to each other. And the value of STEM education, and let me give you an illustration. Back to the example I gave, criticizing engineering for being essentially too focused on equations and not realizing that where you cite the landfill is actually a policy decision and people have to be at the center of it. Well, if you separate STEM entirely from the decision making, then it's only about people and you don't have any credibility in terms of the actual performance of the device that you're suggesting, the landfill. The way you get there, I believe, is the simulation. So no engineer would go to a client and propose to build a bridge without having drawn the blueprints and having done tests in any area which is not very well understood to demonstrate that it in fact works. On the other hand, it's very common, at least in the US, for policy professionals to present a 1,000-page piece of legislation 24 hours before it finds up for a vote, and the ink isn't even dry. And most of the stuff people haven't even read, much less simulated and proved that it works. So there's a lot of room there for improvement. Importance of context versus technical training, and we've just explained that. STEM increases human agency, which then increases human responsibility, which requires higher levels of ethics. This is a big problem. As technology and the government public policy supported technology becomes more and more powerful, it enables smaller and smaller group of people in each generation to impact the lives of a larger and larger number of others. What can go wrong with that? Unintended consequences. Have you heard of climate change? Have you heard of CRISPR technology? Have you heard of social media? Have you heard of nuclear power? These things are policy issues because they affect the welfare of the entire human race. And they're coming out of STEM as a sort of automatic, it must be good because I created it, attitude. We could do something about that in education. Now, when a complex problem is resistant to change, the source is often incorrect fundamental assumptions. I think the way you get there, I really do from the Olin experience, is to return to the fundamentals of understanding what does it mean to be educated in the 21st century? And in our case, what does it mean to be an engineer? And you have to assume that it's not, the answer is not in higher ed, or we would have already fixed it. So you have to listen to the right people. Educational experimentation is the best advice I've got. By the way, it's my last slide here, almost. The importance of public trust. I think you're going to have to look at this. Gallup survey in the United States constantly monitors public opinion about the integrity and the honesty and ethics in different professions. Turns out, by the way, the top two, and this was in December of 2020, medical doctors and nurses, both of them took a big jump up during the pandemic, okay? In December of 2019, medical doctors and engineers were tied. It's about 66. But look at this. Engineers are third in this list. Members of Congress are last. There, in fact, I scanned the entire list of professions. They could not find any public profession, which was measured anyway, that had a lower amount of public confidence. Now, obviously, it's a little better for state politicians or on a more local level. There's a lot of room for improvement here. We need to be much more focused on ethics and on character in our education. Last slide. One of my favorite mentors, Charles Vest, former president of MIT and the US National Academy of Engineering, said, look, when you're thinking about changing education, making universities and engineering schools exciting, creative, adventurous, rigorous, demanding, and empowering milieus is much more important than specifying curricular details. Don't copy what Olin does. Invent your own through experimentation. It's not about the curricular details. They should change every year. It's about the culture. Changing the culture, which is the hardest thing to do, will have the biggest payoff in the end. And that's what I had to say. So I'm going to stop here. And if anybody's still awake, I would be glad to engage with some questions and with our discussants.
Rick, thank you so much. It's just as well my camera was switched off for that, because I was spending most of my time going, yeah, go for it. That's exactly the kind of thing that we were hoping you would say. So thank you so much, Rick. Fantastic. What we're going to do is we're going to move on and ask both Ian and Marcel to speak. And then we'll come back for questions right at the end. So, but Rick, thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. But let's move on. So the next speaker is Professor Ian White, who will give a response to you, Rick. So Professor Ian White was appointed as Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Bath in September 2018. After completing his PhD in 1984, Ian was appointed as Research Fellow and Assistant Lecturer at the University of Cambridge. He became Professor of Physics at the University of Bath in 1990, then moved to the University of Bristol in 1996, where he became head of the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering 2 years later. In 2001, he returned to the University of Cambridge, where he was appointed the Van Eyck Professor of Engineering and head of the Centre for Photonic Systems in the Engineering Department. He was appointed head of the School of Technology, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Institutional Affairs, Master of Jesus College, and Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University. Ian White has carried out substantial research in the field of optoelectronics and optical communications. Highlights of his research include the invention of new techniques for transmitting signals at low cost over optical fiber links for data and wireless communication systems. By the way, we got that word invention again in there. Several of these advances have made a commercial impact, and he has published over 1,000 journal and conference papers. Another stellar CV. Ian, over to you.
Well, I hope you can hear me okay. And can I just say, it's an honor for me to be here to listen to Professor Miller. I have followed his work for many years, and indeed have sought to learn from it as much as possible. I've done so because actually my own journey in engineering very early on got involved in the companies in the Silicon Valley area in California. And of course, for many of us, as I did indeed by the time I was starting to get involved in the 80s, thought of Silicon Valley as this massive organization, a series of organizations clustered together with a huge net wealth. And I remember one evening, some colleagues from Hewlett Packard taking me after dinner in the twilight down this Palo Alto High Street, turning off and ending up at this tiny little garage, which of course, as some of you will be aware, is actually being the garage that Hewlett and Packard started their company in. I was fascinated by it at the time. What struck me actually was how little there was to market. It was in a garden of a private home, but actually there was a plaque. And what really surprised me was that the plaque said, this garage is the birthplace of the world's first high technology region, Silicon Valley. But it didn't go on to focus on Hewlett and Packard. It said rather, the idea for such a region originated with Dr. Frederick Terman, a Stanford University professor, who encouraged his students to start up their own electronics companies in the area, instead of joining established firms in the East. The first two students to follow his advice were obviously William Hewlett and David Packard. And of course, if you look at the history, you can see actually what an ambition it was. I love this quote. When we were set out to create a community of technical scholars in Silicon Valley, Frederick Terman said, there wasn't much here and the rest of the world looked awfully big. Now a lot of the rest of the world is here. And if you look at the narrative, you see that engagement, which Professor Miller talks about so much about students, had formed very much in those early ideas. And of course, the Boston area can give very equivalent success stories about what impact universities can have in the engineering space. And the work that Professor Miller's carried out at Olin, in my view, has been truly pioneering and outstanding and hugely impactful in building on this model of this intense relationship with students in which you encourage them to aspire in all sorts of different ways, which goes well beyond the academic curriculum and touches on character. And in the UK, it is unquestionably the case there are similar examples. Universities play very important roles, and the engineering departments within them do them in driving innovation and in driving forward students to have their vision. But there are also issues. It's often talked, and I'm particularly grateful for Tim for discussing many of these points with me on occasion, and indeed this slide, that we bemoan a skills gap. And of course, in part that's due to the fact that often it's difficult for UK universities to attract enough students to do engineering. And indeed, actually, companies will often comment as to how they wish there were more engineers to employ. And part of the argument can be traced to the fact that many universities in the UK particularly will insist on physics for entry. And of course, if one's thinking of this from an EDI perspective, only about 20% of A-level physics students are female. And so actually an obvious immediate question is to say, well, is it really appropriate to be choosing our student population from a total of about 30,000 individuals out of a possible population of over 600,000 annually? And for me, this, of course, has been something of great concern, having spent much of my life in engineering departments. And therefore, I've been very privileged over the last 8 to 10 years or so to just watch some of the discussions that have gone on about how engineering can be made more inclusive, and how it's made more, how school children can be encouraged to be more aware of it. And one thing that I've been particularly pleased to watch is the introduction of engineering into a school called St. Faith's in Cambridge, where I used to live and work, and where I've witnessed what's been going on. The aim of this started, as I said, very much about how can we make children aware of engineering. And indeed, actually, in early phases, we're all about maybe have an enrichment day or something like that, just to allow children to find out more. However, as discussions grew, they started talking about maybe we should introduce it into the curriculum. And the interesting thing is now it's part of the curriculum, not because of a desire to make engineering of a topic of awareness for children, so they therefore are more likely to, well, at least they know what it is and therefore more likely to do it. But actually it's there now because, as this diagram highlights, it brings benefit to every single other part of the curriculum, they believe, just as other parts of the curriculum bring benefit to it. And actually, as an integrated part of this, the education of the school, they find that it educates children better. The ages the children involved for engineering itself are from 7 to 13 years old. The school is starting at a 4-year-old age level. And obviously, if you look at that diagram, you'll see huge parallels with the work that Professor Miller has done. And of course, it is unquestionably the case that his ideas have found realism and truth in this instance here. Part of the reason why it's benefited the curriculum is even as young as 7 to 8-year-old children are encouraged into activities that are very much about doing things and achieving things, often in teams. And they learn very early on this virtuous circle model where they, given a challenge, will ask about it, imagine solutions, plan what they're going to do, create, and then of course ask, well, how's it gone? Can I improve this? And it's back into this virtuous circle. And this will then ask them to ask whether there have been solutions before, what new other solutions might be there. Have they gone through the drawing that Professor Miller talked about, building, and then how can I make this better? And how can I modify a solution? How can we test it? And indeed, actually, therefore, how can we go? And of course, those principles apply to all sorts of other parts of the school curriculum. Evident examples of very early work are these are the first year of children, where they're encouraged to make conducting and non-conducting dough, put them together to have little circuits so that they can build little cars with headlights that light up and turn on and off. And then the children are are given a series of challenges at later years. This is an example of a lesson plan. Pretend you're in a desert island. How do you go about making a shelter? Oh, by the way, you've only got newspaper and tape. And how can you work as a team to build it? And the whole series of very short action activities are engaged in by the children. This is an in part structure of a shelter made of newspaper, which the team is to design and build. It's to withstand rain, the rain being represented by a watering can pouring water over it, and it's designed wind as according to a hairdryer. And indeed, actually, often there are quite interesting challenges that are put in for the children. So for example, in many of these work, if they, for example, find they've broken something or run out of something, they'll be asked how can they reuse the materials for maximum benefit? How do they solve that problem? And in some of these activities, actually, they'll be allowed to talk while they're planning it, but once they start to build, part of the learning will be how do you build something like that in silence. By the end, however, of the series of years to the final year, the 12 to 13-year-olds, they are engaging in their own activities. And for me, this taught me quite a lot about some of the things that I know Tim is very keen on, in terms of thinking in terms of university life, and also resonates very strongly with what Professor Miller has said, and I think are key points. Because if you look at the final year individual projects, you find students doing really interesting things and thinking in different ways. So I regret to say I'm not able to really comment on much detail about it because I don't understand it, but this is a pupil who has used a computer using AI in the computer to teach the computer to play Tetris so that the child can play Tetris against the computer. This is a child who has a great interest in horse riding, has noticed over the years, as a very young child actually, that often the accidents riding horses were particularly difficult if legs or feet got caught in the stirrup. And so came up with the idea, well, can you build a quick release horse stirrup to reduce injuries? Now, for me, I find these final year projects particularly interesting. If it was many of the departments I know, going back some years ago, there would have been reluctance to start to think about project work like this unless the students had done the necessary curricular work. You know, do they understand the underlying principles of AI to allow them fully to go ahead and have a go at a project like that? Do they have the maths? Do they have the computer science? Do they have the vector understanding to design quick release mechanisms or things like that? Do they have really the skills needed before being able to challenge themselves with this? But here, these children are 12 years old, or maybe 13 by the end of the project work. They haven't been told not to be able to do that. That level of ambition is there. And of course, at that age, they feel in many ways able to have a go at things and take the risk that many, sometimes older children or young people would struggle with. And it comes through very clearly with the feedback. And may I stress that one of the big lessons from this coursework is actually that the girls do as well as the boys, which isn't true of every subject. I apologize for the medical representatives here at this lecture, but for me, the best quote, setting aside the one relating to doctors, is from a child saying, engineering makes the impossible possible. And of course, that is exactly what we want. We want children that are, and young people and older people that can work in teams, be prepared to tackle problems, be prepared to think about the totality of the issues around it, as the Professor Miller so powerfully said. And it's, of course, crucially important. I'm very grateful for this slide from Tim. But obviously, if you think about many major engineering projects, the influence on the success of the project is often right at the start. If you can get the right approach to it, if you can find the right questions to answer, the right whole bunch of things to think about, and therefore the right approach to tackle, often it can make a huge difference to the success of the project. Yes, there will be a role for really doing very advanced calculations, simulations, detailed sums and sizing, but often those are done once the initial approach has been sought. And so for universities, as much as the case in the school education, the education should take the big decisions quickly and early and often within teams rather than individuals. And so I'm very grateful to Tim's work, which I think has been hugely important within as part of his work within the University of Bath, in listing these sort of mindsets and areas of focus that often we need to think about when asking ourselves, what should our learning outcomes be at university level in engineering? A mindset to temporarily borrow as little as material as possible, to design for cradle to cradle, creativity, knowing to ask the right questions, confidence and empowerment. And all of these are things resonating so hugely on what Professor Miller has said. So to cut to the quick, aware that we've got a major future ahead of us. Like I have a very close friend who once calculated, he's my age, that this was 5 years ago, that approximately 80% of the publications in electrical engineering, and therefore arguably 80% of the knowledge in electrical engineering, had happened since I was a student. And thinking that that rate of engineering gathering is not, of advance is not reducing, where you can conceive of engineers as Siram Ramakrishnan, who's a wonderful expert in this, National University Singapore, arguing that, you know, there are all sorts of future roles of engineering that are largely unimaginable for us at the moment, but could well happen at the current time, but could well happen in the coming years. Organ and tissue engineer, urban farmer or food engineers, deep ocean engineers, space traffic engineers. Aware of all of these, it would be really interesting to see how engineering education can learn as much as it can from the work that Professor Miller has done. And so thank you, Professor Miller, for your leadership in the education of a subject that makes the impossible possible. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Fantastic. So we move on again before we come to questions at the end. So thank you so much, Ian, for that response. We're now going to hear from Marcel McManus. So Professor Marcel McManus is Director of the Centre for Sustainable and Circular Technologies here at the University of Bath and a Professor of Energy and Environmental Engineering. She's an authority on life cycle assessment and sustainable systems, renewable technologies and bioenergy. She is passionate about decarbonisation and embedding critical thinking and sustainability into her teaching. Marcel's contributions have been recognised on various occasions, both within her home institution and beyond. In 2008, she was a joint recipient of the IMechE George Stephenson Medal for her work on wind turbines. In 2011, she won the University of Bath John Willis Award, and in 2017, the University of Bath Excellence in Doctoral Supervision Award. In 2019, Professor McManus was named Most Inspirational Woman in STEM in the West Women Awards, and in 2020, she won the FDM Every Woman Academic Award. And if I may add to that wonderful CV, Marcel is in a very good mood because she is Bath lead on a £20 million recently funded project. Marcel, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I am in a very good mood. It's a fantastic project on decarbonisation, which is very close to my heart. But one of the other things that I would just like to say is thank you so much to Ian and to Rick for their fantastic projects and for their fantastic talks. And I thought I would just pick up on some of the things that have been said over the last hour. And one of the things was that everything is different now because we know how to Google. So I just thought I would show that I absolutely do know how to Google. And I was able to pick some of my favorite quotes from the talk and find some images for them whilst the talks was going on and were going on. And I think education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. It must be something that's truly part of our ethos as university educators and academics. We really need to be lighting that fire and setting students off out into the world enthusiastic and passionate about what they've learned and what they're able to do. And I also was very interested in the quote that we can teach maths to those who have a vision. And I haven't added the second part, which Rick had there, which was much more easily. And then we can teach some people a vision who can do maths, because we really need to understand that engineering and science is about understanding the challenges that are put in front of us. And there are so many of them. We face some fundamental challenges at the moment on climate change, health, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we really need to think about the footprints that we're leaving. We need to think about the footprints that we are leaving on students, that students are leaving on us and the university, and the footprints that all of us are leaving on the world. We need to make sure that these footprints are appropriate, that we're sensitive and we're acting equally towards everybody. And engineering and science really has the ability to ensure that we instill all of these attributes into people and into the things that we are doing, that we're designing, as Ian has just said, with his lists of things that we can be considering. So we really need to be creating the ability to meet these challenges of climate change, health, and COVID-19 recovery. So we need all of these things. We need decision making, we need imagination, we need the ability to understand and embed sustainability, decarbonisation. We need to be artistic. So few people think that we need to be artistic as engineers, and we need to ask the right questions. We need to understand how to influence as well. We need to know how to work as teams, but we need to understand how we influence people and things to make changes. And we need to be open and excited and really willing to embrace things that come towards us and the challenges that we face. And we need to empower all of our students in order to do this too. And I think this does require a different way of teaching and engaging with students so that it's not just one direction. We're learning from everyone all the time. And one of the best things about my job is going and talking with students. They think I'm teaching them, but really they're teaching me. And we need to really just switch things around so we all know that we can learn from everyone all the time. I just thought I would share this with you, and I'm going to just be very quick in my talk today because we've heard so much of fantastic information from Rick and from Ian, and there's lots of time for questions at the end. But I just wanted to share this. This is a thought experiment. Results from a thought experiment that I did with some colleagues in North America. And really this was put together so that we could think about how we can measure the environmental impact of different technologies at different stages. So we're looking at technologies which we understand they're relatively high technology readiness levels, so that we know there are things that already exist in a market that understands them, all the way down to the far more exciting things, which are the emerging technologies and really things that we can do lots with. And we need to have a far bigger imagination to think about how the creative changes that we can make. And we did this thought experiment with mobility. And so in the top right-hand corner, you can see we've got internal combustion engines. So that's a well-developed technology, and the market is relatively saturated. And you have market maturity on one side and technology maturity going up on the other axis. And down in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got a mobility system such as the Hyperloop. So nobody's made it. We don't know how it would work. We don't know how it would affect the market. So the uncertainty associated with this is huge. Now, we put this together to try and work out how we can create better assessment techniques for these different technologies in different markets, particularly for their environmental impact. But actually, it struck me that this is a really good way of thinking about what we need to be engaging with as engineers and as educators. We don't want to be focusing up in that top right-hand corner. We know how to do this. We've known how to do this for a very long time. In order to make changes, in order to meet the challenges that we have as future engineers, as a future planet, we need to be down in that bottom left-hand corner. We need to be teaching our engineers, our future scientists, our future politicians, really how to imagine something different and equip them to be able to understand the uncertainties, the risks, and how to make those things much, much better. So we need to be down in those lower quadrants rather than up in the top. In order to do that, we need to really be focusing on that creativity, the adaptability, the change, and fundamental to me, obviously, the sustainability and the leadership. We really need to be embedding this in all of our engineers, as well as the maths and the technology, which obviously Rick said we needed to continue with, but we really need to be focusing on this. And perhaps teaching, we need to think about how we can teach differently. and how we can encourage our students to learn differently in order to really adapt to the fundamental challenges that we have ahead of us. So I just wanted to be really, really brief and say thank you so much to Rick Miller and to Ian White for the amazing talk they've given us. We all need to think about the footprints that we leave on the planet. We all need to think about the footprints that we leave on the students who leave us and go off into the world, and hope that the footprints that we leave upon them can make them be the best people that they possibly can be, because we actually have a very important job and a job with huge responsibilities, because we can change and influence the way people think. We can encourage them to be creative. We can encourage everybody into this fascinating topic and subject and give them the tools to really embrace and to overcome some of the challenges that the globe is facing. And I'll pass back to Tim now.
In other words, engineering without a hard hat. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Marcel. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you. Okay, it's open question time. So we've had questions which have come in, and I'm going to direct various questions. I'm going to go with the number of, and this sounds terrible, it sounds very Facebooky, but I'm going to go with the number of likes. So it's, in other words, asking the most popular questions, if I may. So I'm going to start with a question from Nuno Rees, which many people seem to really like. They like the question. Rick, I'm going to put this one to you, if I may. I'm going to slightly reword it. You started with a blank sheet of paper, and you said yourself that you were the first employee. What if you have an existing faculty? How do you make the fundamental changes that you have made?
That's a really good question. In fact, if we can't answer that question, then Olin is just a boutique program under glass that you can look at, but it won't really have an impact. Before I answer, though, I have to say one thing, having heard others' talks here, absolutely thrilled with Ian's remarks and with Marcel's remarks. And I feel a little uncomfortable that way too much of this is talking about me personally and not the Olin community. You have to realize that these changes that we're talking about were almost entirely done by a team and a group effort at Olin. So don't equate this to Rick Miller, or equate this to the community at Olin. Now, to the question, we have worried about that since the beginning, and there have been a number of attempts to transfer the basic learning at Olin to other institutions. One of the things that we did at the beginning, what's 10 years ago now, is partner with one of the largest public universities in North America to see if how much of what we're doing can be transferred. This is the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. It's got about 40,000 students. They don't have the same kind of start from a blank sheet or admissions criteria that we do. They adapted about 3 of the fundamental principles that Olin has across their engineering school. And this resulted in a transformational set of ideas at Illinois. And it's, of course, taken its own path from here. There's a book written about this. So if you want to really get into what works and what doesn't work, I'd suggest you look at the book. It's called A Whole New Engineer. It's co-authored by 2 people, David Goldberg, who at the time was a senior faculty member at Illinois, and Mark Somerville, who is currently the provost at Olin College. So to save time, I think I'll leave it there. The bottom line here is you can only teach what you know. So you have to have faculty teaching mindset that have the mindset. That's number 1. Number 2, you don't need to have every faculty member on board to get meaningful results. If you have about 10%, if they're the right 10%, you can really influence students. There's an interesting Gallup study in 2016 that together with Purdue University about what really matters in higher ed. Turns out 2 things really matter in terms of well-being of graduates 20 years after they graduate. Number 1, someone cared about me as a student. And number 2, they had experiential learning in which they did almost exactly what Ian presented in this Faith Francis School in Cambridge. They felt engaged and empowered, and they could change the world. Those 2 things. Notice they didn't say everybody cared about me as a student. They said somebody cared about me as a student. If a student takes on average 30 courses over 4 years for their degree, and they have an instructor for each one. If one of those instructors changes the student's life, it results in this outcome. That's 3%. If you have 10% of your faculty involved in this, you have an excess of what you need. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rick. The next one is related in some way, and it's more or less you have a particular brand, and when I say you, it's not just Olin. There'll be other universities that you've already mentioned who have a particularly different way of doing things. How do you convince the top students to take on what they might consider to be an experiment as opposed to a traditional program?
Yeah, this really kept me up at night, particularly at the beginning. No one had ever heard of Olin. Who is going to come here? And I was even more worried about faculty. What faculty members would come to a school that doesn't offer a PhD, does not even talking about winning the Nobel Prize, so you're not going to be a big star here. I assumed that we would not have much to work with in terms of applications. For that Olin partner year that we talked about, where we had 15 boys and 15 girls that lived in a parking lot for a year, we had about 600 applications. These were kids, about half of them turned down MIT to come to Olin. We were shocked, honestly. What did we tell them? We told them, when people ask you where you're going to college, tell them you're building your own, okay? And then of course you better follow through with that. So we wound up having to be on a first name basis, involving them in planning and executing all the experiments. It turns out that engaging people is a good idea, particularly if you want the best ideas and if you want them to passionately pursue them. If they're involved in inventing them, you have a chance. And of course, exactly the same principle is true with the faculty. We've had about 150 faculty applications for every position we filled at the beginning. We recruited 2 faculty members from the tenure track at MIT who joined us immediately. We had 3 of them who were very senior, including the Associate Dean of Engineering and the Chair of Electrical Engineering from Vanderbilt. I believe there's a real appetite for this kind of change that exists already in higher education. It has no outlet. It's not a kind of appetite that is easily addressed within the traditional higher educational system. And you'll be surprised if you provide opportunities by the people who come. But of course, you have to engage them. One of the other questions that flows out of this is, okay, so they come, you can only teach what you know. This is a very different way of teaching. How do you get there? So there's a whole process for this. And I would highly encourage people who are interested in that to take a look at the summer programs that Olin has developed for influencing other institutions. Olin has been visited by more than 800 universities from more than 50 countries in 10 years. They have a summer institute that has about 100 faculty from around the world to explore this on their own. One of the principles that Olin uses for this, and this I'm painting with a broad brush, so not everybody has gone through this. The idea is to eliminate the sense that you're here because you're the world's expert in something and you're infallible and you better never make a mistake. So in the first year, largely, we assign them to teach in courses that they are not an expert in. Now this is fundamental. So I was at Big 10 and Pac-10 universities for 25 years before coming to Olin. The menu of options for me to teach was quite limited. It had to do with my thesis. When you go to Olin, the menu of options is quite large and it doesn't have anything to do with your thesis, guaranteed. And secondly is you're put on a team. So you have to teach with 2 or 3 other people. That is uncomfortable for most faculty members because it makes you vulnerable. You have to admit that you don't know the answers, and you have to learn how to collaborate. Because if you can't collaborate with others, you're not going to develop a collaborative mindset that transfers to the students. I'll stop there.
Very good, Rick. Thank you. You might have spotted in the commentary that you have a very proud parent, Jen Smilg, who's sent a message saying, as a current parent of an Olin student, this event is very inspirational to listen to. So, which is a very nice comment. So thank you, Jen. I'm going to direct the next one, if I may, at Marcel, if I may. And it goes back, it's a comment which really, Rick, you've just touched on, and but Marcel, you were quite explicit about, was the lighting a fire rather than filling the pail. And the question is should we be just touching on things in lectures and then relying on students to learn things for themselves?
Excellent question. I think we've got to have a balance. I think we need to teach students some things, but on the whole, I think often when I'm teaching, I will end up not talking about what I thought I was going to teach or talk about because of the questions that I get from my students. And absolutely, I think we should be making sure that we guide students so that they have the fundamental knowledge that they need to have, but we are enabling them to go off and get the knowledge, which we can help them find, we can help direct, we can answer questions about. But I think if we don't do that, then we're not creating people who have the curiosity, who I say creating people, I mean encouraging people who have the curiosity and have that ability to gather their own knowledge. So I think we do need to be encouraging people to really read. You know, we talked about reading for a degree, and I think we should be really encouraging students to be doing that.
Thank you, Marcel. I completely agree. Ian, there's one here directed specifically at you. It says a question for Ian, and it's to do with opening up opening up access to engineering education, particularly looking at A levels in biology, which we know for lower quintile public schools in the UK often is a proxy for the brightest school children. And the question really is, what are your thoughts in terms of how we might be doing things better to open up access to engineering? You're muted, Ian.
I think it's a really good question, and I am very grateful. Actually, though I have to say, Tim, I think probably you will be stronger at answering it than me, because I know how much you're doing within the Royal Academy and other institutes in the UK at the moment on this. I personally think that there's a huge scope, and particularly looking forward at how engineering will evolve as a field, where you can see it becoming much more interdisciplinary and drawing much more on a wider range of disciplines than it's possibly associated for us to try and break out of some of the limitations that some university engineering departments have felt in the past about what would warrant an appropriate student to come into that. And I think there needs to be a really active debate. And I think part of it is this question about how do you make sure that you give the students the opportunities to study engineering as it is and will going forward, using the wider range of skills which they will benefit from schools, which in some cases will be outside the faculty actually expertise that we'll have. So I do think there are a number of opportunities. I think there are opportunities for the engineering departments, and indeed actually the professional institutions to become more involved with schools in discussing actually what is a good win-win solution for both sides. I think there's a really interesting debate as to where engineering faculties should see their own limits, i.e. to what extent they should engage with other departments in the university, or indeed actually recruit faculty to be very, very heavily involved in the curriculum itself. And obviously, without any question, I think there needs to be an ongoing discussion about the nature of the curriculum, particularly in the first year or so, when often that frames very much the way individuals think, and actually frames the opportunities.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a core point, the point Rick was saying earlier, that we need to be, first of all, teaching the right people and then the right things in the right way. So it's a really important question. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to end with the last question to you, Rick, if I may, and it might be a binary answer. I'm not sure. How important is the accreditation process to you in the education process at Olin and in progressive approaches to engineering education?
Well, it's a really important question if you're planning to have any kind of influence in education, because accreditation plays a really important role. It's common in engineering universities to have a sense of of tension within accreditation board. I mean, who are these people that show up from the outside and tell us that what we're doing is not the right thing? But remember, they're there to protect the public. So public safety, I mentioned this business about making sure that the students learn the stress equations before they graduate from aerospace engineering, because you don't want to crash in an airplane. And that's a caricature of what they do. In practice, I don't think there is as much tension as you might think. I look at it this way. There's a role for accreditation and there's a role for creativity and innovation. And they play on the different ends of the spectrum. So if you imagine engineering education, for example, as a bell-shaped curve, the highest impact that I've seen accreditation play is with the bottom tail of the distribution, when things are really not going well and the public is being taken advantage of. And the outcome for that education is not good either for the student or for the society. You want an accreditation board to put an end to it. In fact, I am currently chairing a visiting committee for an accreditation of another university, and I've done this many times. On the other hand, if the accreditation board's rules are rigid, and if they simply count things and they don't take into account the culture of the institution that's applying them, they can easily prevent creativity and innovation and strike down creative ideas. Somebody will say, oh, we thought about that back in 2015, and the accreditation board didn't like it, so we're just going to quit because it's a waste of effort. And that's death to creativity. So you need both. At a place, at a place like Olin, I'm currently at MIT, and I know at Harvard, I was on their visiting committee for a while. There's a constant tension to show, why should we bother to be accredited? Our graduates are learning way more than the accreditation low bar asks anyway, and it's preventing us from being creative. And that's a good question. So Harvard's approach is to provide 2 alternate degrees. You can get an AB degree, which is not accredited, but has not prevented people from advancing their career, or you can get the BS degree, which is accredited, which is recognized by the accreditation board in engineering. Olin, so far, has been fully accredited in everything we do. And the reason has been 85% of the engineering graduates in the US, I think that's the right number, graduate from public universities. And a public university doesn't have the option of not being accredited in most states, because the legislature will discover that they're paying for an engineering education that doesn't meet the accreditation standards or doesn't bother to meet the accreditation standards. They're likely to cut off the funding. And so those institutions need it. So if you're going to lead and you're thinking of different ways of innovating, we've chosen to provide an educational model which is accreditable and doing it by demonstration.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rick. I chair an accreditation body in the UK, and I agree with every word you've said. That there is a tension, but actually the reality is that accrediting bodies are not the ogres that people sometimes pretend they are. And I do mean the word pretend. So thank you very much, Steve. Can I thank you, Rick, yourself, and Marcel and Ian? Thank you very much. It was an absolutely fabulous event. Thank you, everybody who's asked questions. And I really, really hope that you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. It's been a fabulous event. And IPR, all the team in IPR for putting this on in the first place. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. So thank you and see you again. Bye.
Thank you.